Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happen to be watching this. We are going to chat about Chapter 3, Colonial Ways of Life. So we are going to start with Mr. Shy or Mr. Shea, I'm not sure, and see what he has to say about race-based slavery.
During the late 17th century, a very important change occurred in the American colonies. Up to that point, indentured servants were the primary source of labor for the American colonies. That changed, however, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries as the number of enslaved Africans increased dramatically. Many plantation owners, especially in the southern colonies such as Virginia and South Carolina, preferred slaves over servants for several reasons. First, slaves serve for life, unlike indentured servants that serve for a fixed number of years and then they were free. At the same time, the plantation owners preferred African workers because many of them, coming from West Africa, were already experienced at the growing of rice, which in South Carolina became a hugely profitable crop. Over time, as the number of enslaved Africans in the colonies grew, and the number grew dramatically in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, especially in the southern colonies, those colonies felt the need to create slave codes. That is, the colonial legislatures, dominated by whites, created very specific restrictions on slaves, outlining what it meant to be a slave, that they were to serve for life, and that they were essentially under the complete control of their owner or master. So by the 18th century, slavery had become the norm rather than the exception, especially in the South, and of course ultimately it would become the most important force in the shaping of American social history up through the Civil War.
Alrighty, so let's talk some early American settlers. They're usually under the age of 25, they're male, and they're poor. Why else are they going to risk their life on a several long-month trip to a place where they had no one to help them? Many of them do come from the New World. They come to the New World from the British Isles. Mostly England, but you do have some Scotch and Irish. It is purely legend. When the colonists first arrived, they landed in virgin territory, never touched by human hand. I think we're quite aware of that by this point. Native Americans had been here for centuries. They had hunted and cultivated, and often kind of destroyed along the way as well. But they truly lived off the land. Between 1750 and 1775, the population of the New World is going to grow to about 2.5 million people. This is a plan of a newly cleared American farm. It does show how the trees are cut down and the stumps are left to rot. You let the stumps rot, it's much easier to get them out of the ground. Alright. So, in America, birth rates and death rates. So, there are earlier marriages that are going on. People are getting married younger. So the birth rate in the English colonies was higher than it was in the rest of Europe. And after the first decade of colonization, the death rate is actually lower than in Europe. And the average life expectancy for men could actually reach the age of 70. It's pretty close to what it is now. It might be in the 80s by now, but it's not much lower. It's not much higher. As we're settling the colonies, single men are needed to perform the labor to get the colony started, so there are a lot more men here than women. So men outnumber women 2 to 1. Once the colonies do begin to thrive, the ratio between the sexes does level off. More women do migrate over here or immigrate over here. Let's see. Liberty and freedom that exist in the colonies did not apply to women, who at the time were still forced to abide by the European custom of deferring to their husbands. However, there is one place that they are given more authority, that is in spiritual matters, except for the Puritans. We remember that, Anne Hutchinson. In colonial times, the role of the female was to maintain the homestead while the males worked outside of the home. And that continued on for many, 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 many generations. This is a needlework done by Prudence Punderson from 1776, and she's going to show the domestic path from cradle to coffin, followed by most colonial women. So they're born, they work, they die. All right. So it is often assumed the majority of new colonists were very pious. That is not often the case, especially in the South. Many of them are here to make money. Many parts of the British colonies, the official religion was that of the Church of England. And in the colonies, the form and practice of that church evolved along a different path. In the 17th century, the strictness of the Puritan and Quaker faith gives way to emphasis on the reasonableness of Christianity. People do not really feel Quakers and Puritans are reasonable. From the start, the South is an agricultural economy. They have longer growing seasons and more fertile land that provides them a leg up on the North, which neither of them had in abundance. Because this is how they are making a majority of their money. This is what their economy is built on. They need laborers. And so one of their major problems was providing enough laborers to cultivate and harvest the crops from their vast tracts of lands. This is where slavery comes in. Another factor in manufacturing and agricultural economy is that there must be a market for the produce. So England provides a ready and willing market. Because again, if you look at where England is located versus how much further south the southern part of North America is, big difference in climate. Originally, you have the importation of slaves to colonies that's hindered by the vast demand for them in the West Indies and the sugar plantations of Brazil. That is where a majority of the slaves are going. There is a continued influx of white workers from Europe, our indentured servants. They do help keep the number required of slaves down. But when Great Britain begins to experience a period of rapid economic expansion, those immigrants, those indentured servants, they don't really want to come anymore, because why do they need to if they are getting the opportunity for a better life in their own country? And so slaves become even more essential to get produce to the market. Southern colonial plantations, often constructed with easy access to ocean-going vessels. So you can see this is a tobacco label from 1730 and how close they are to the ocean or to the sea. All right. So they're growing a lot of produce and agriculture in the South, but they don't have all the goods that can be purchased in Great Britain. So that's where they get most of their consumer goods is from Great Britain. They're using the money from their crops to do that. A lot of times they would overextend themselves to craft the style of society that they deem themselves worthy for, as if they were still in England. You do have a very upper class group that emerges, plantation owners that do emerge and kind of don't die off until after the Civil War. Quite often you have a favorable balance of trade with the motherland is offset by invisible fees to middlemen, insurance companies, and so on, which does make it difficult for the colonists to get ahead. Alright. So instead of creating the equivalent of English manners in the New World as of those in the South had done, because remember plantation style is going to be very equivalent to that lord of the manor with your peasants and your serfs. But in the New World, a lot of them, especially in New England, they're going to focus on the growth of towns. And it's going to be more along the lines of a traditional English village. The houses built by New Englanders were very practical. They had steep roofs to allow snow to slide off and not accumulate. They were usually dark. They were only lit by gas lamps or candles. They did not have a lot of glass to put in windows because glass had to be imported from England. As far as their enterprise goes, it is easier to catch fish than it is to cultivate the land and grow crops in New England. They do not have the growing season. They do not have the soil. So that becomes their principal means of income. They do grow some crops, but basically it's like a family farm that's going to feed just that family. Meet basic needs. They were not able to really make a profit off of that. However, there is a lot of wood in the surrounding forest. New England soon becomes renowned for its shipbuilding industry, and that does last for a long time. They are primarily involved in providing England with raw materials, not manufacturing finished goods. New Englanders had to import their items from the mother country, so they had to get finished goods, manufactured goods from Great Britain. Since they were building their own ships and able to use their own ships, they're able to transform this shipping industry into an economic juggernaut for the colonies. They're able to make a fortune off their shipping. So this is a picture of fishers, so fishing for curing and drying cod in Newfoundland in the early 1700s. For centuries, the rich fishing grounds of the North Atlantic provided New Englanders with a prosperous industry. Even today, that is a prosperous industry. A lot of fresh fish and seafood. Alright, so this is your Atlantic trade routes. You can see your triangular trade right here. Africa sends slaves to the Caribbean. The Caribbean sends more slaves, molasses, money, sugar to New England. They send rum back to Africa. So there's the small, and then you can also do the larger one. So you get your slaves here. You have your raw goods that are going to get to England, and then England's going to ship manufactured goods down to Africa. All right. So contrary to public perception now, the Puritans are not the dour, intolerant individuals that are portrayed in the media. They were moderates who believed that anything done to excess was bad. But they were kind of strict on their society. They wanted to purify the Anglican Church of any Catholic remnants. Remember, they thought the English Church was way too Catholic. They believed that they had entered into a covenant with God based on John Calvin's teachings. Although many teachings of Calvin promoted the concept of democracy, it does not invade Puritan politics. They are not democratic. Let's see. So as the population of colonies increased in New England, so does the strain between your different immigrant groups. As the merchants continue to import goods from England, materialism begins to take effect, and it weakens the emphasis on the church that had existed previously. You do have your witch trials going on, Salem, Massachusetts, 1692. You have 30 citizens that have been executed from witchcraft and over 300 who are accused of having practiced it. All right. So society and economy in the middle colonies. So in the same way that the middle colonies existed between New England and the South, so they go between. So New England's up north, the South is obviously down south, middle colonies are in between. They're in the middle of their economic makeup as well. They created their own mix of agriculture and trade depending on their location, quality, and quantity of land. So they weren't able to be like the shipbuilders and the fishers that New England was able to be, but they couldn't do the strong agricultural economy that the South could do. The South and the North, again, are settled by British citizens. The Middle is going to receive some immigrants from Germany. And I believe Ireland, maybe? Or Scotland. I'll get a map in a second, so we'll confirm that. 18th century, Pennsylvania becomes the point of entrance for immigration to the colonies. So instead of traversing the Appalachian Mountains on the western border of Pennsylvania, they fill in the areas between the mountains and the colonies that had yet to be settled by Europeans. Okay, so here's the map. So all the light green is going to be the English. You can see it's the predominant group of people. Africans are going to be down in the southern colonies, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Your Scots-Irish, those are going to be all your light blue. So you can see those are other people from the British Isles. The German are kind of infiltrating right there in the really light purple. And they're kind of going a little bit inland too. You have the Dutch up there on the Hudson River in New York. The Highland Scots are going to be North Carolina, South Carolina there with the dark green, and then of course the French Catholics are up north in Canada on the St. Lawrence River. Let's see. Racial prejudice is becoming very, very ingrained in society. 17th century colonists perceive it as a way of living in an imperfect world. It is important to remember that a color of a person's skin was the indicator of whether he or she would be a slave. So Africans and Indians, darker skin. Then the colonists, they were made slaves. People of European descent were not. Demand for slaves soured in the southern colonies during the 18th century, largely because they were encouraging the production of their own. So kids were being born into slavery. By 1750, there were almost 250,000 slaves in British America. You do have one of the largest slave rebellions that occurs in 1739 in Stono, South Carolina. The slaves in general were not uprising for the most part. Generally, they would do things like work slowly, stuff like that. Very non-violent types of protest, I guess you could say. Things that really wouldn't harm them too much. So a rebellion occurs. It is a rebellion of slaves. Lots of people do die from it. It happens in South Carolina. Most of the rebels are killed. Ones who aren't killed immediately are captured and then killed. And what it does is it actually causes the people in South Carolina to become very afraid of slave rebellions. They start to be even harder on their slaves. New York City actually has more slaves than any other city in colonial America. But most of your New York slaves are going to be utilized as servants. You have New Amsterdam, so African slaves are a significant part of their economy. It is a Dutch colony of New Amsterdam that later becomes New York City once it's overtaken by the British. Alright, so the social elites in the cities were dominated by the merchants and the ship owners who controlled the trade. After that, you have your middle class, which are going to be retailers, innkeepers, and artisans, and then underneath that you have your sailors and your unskilled workers. In order for the trade to flow, roads had to be built and maintained. The first roads were just kind of improved Indian trails, but as roads were being constructed and travel was increasing, you get the birth of kind of the taverns as our place to stop for travelers. So same like a gas station today. This is a business card from a tobacco company from the 1770s. It does capture the atmosphere of late 18th century taverns. And in Philadelphia, tavern converse while they drink ale and smoke pipes. All right. So the 17th century is known as the Enlightenment. It happens a lot in Europe. You've got scientific thought and inquiry, which is going to revolutionize society with new ideas and new concepts. It leads to the creation of many new concepts in the Americas, and perhaps the guy who really epitomized that is going to be Benjamin Franklin. So Franklin is an inventor. He used scientific process to create such items as bifocals. He was the first one to make bifocals. The lightning rod, so remember he's out there with the kite and the key with lightning to create electricity, essentially. The Franklin stove and the glass harmonica. So huge inventor, Benjamin Franklin was. During the time period, educating children is the responsibility of the church and their families. New England, they are very close together, so they're actually kind of able to start schools to teach children outside of the home and the church. So our friend Benjamin Franklin right there. Inventor, philosopher, entrepreneur, and statesman. Remember, he is one of our founding fathers. So I'm sure we will continue to talk about him. All right. So the Great Awakening is one of the first popular movements among the colonies before the Revolution that is going to span all 13 colonies. Jonathan Edwards is going to travel the colonies preaching sermons on renouncing materialism, the Enlightenment, and the need to return to the faith. So this is Jonathan Edwards. All right. Then you have Whitefield, George Whitefield, who was also a preacher during the Great Awakening and encouraged his listeners to renounce their worldly goods. This is George Whitefield telling everybody you don't need stuff. The Great Awakening undermines many churches with the teachings that they were not needed, that the individual could commune with God on his or her own terms, which is not going to be popular with churches. Not popular at all. So we saw them already. Oh, and that's it. We're done. I think that's everything for now. As we continue to move forward past like the 1750s and stuff, we'll hit the French and Indian War, which is really going to enhance the troubles between the 13 colonies and Great Britain. Talk to y'all later. Bye.